we feel like apologetics or evangelism or public Christianity is about control. In other words, I'm going to be in a conversation and I need to control this conversation. That's kind of spilled over into kind of how we view relationships and how we view evangelism and apologetics. So I don't want to go too deep here, but there's a lot of kind of ways that speak about this as like staying in control of the conversation. Here's technique. We will give you the technique and you kind of manage this. And I'm wanting to say, well, actually, this is about being attentive. It's about being attentive in that you're a good reader and listener. And so I think reading good books helps us become special novels and stories help us be good listeners to the world, be listeners to people, but being also a good listener to the Spirit, being attentive to what the Spirit's doing, and not being in control, actually. I want to say, I don't want to come in here and feel like I need to manipulate this conversation. It doesn't mean that I'm not kind of thinking about and trying to understand the cultural context and I will say some things to challenge people, absolutely. But I don't want to mechanize this.
Well, hi everyone, and welcome back to Nuance, where we seek to be faithful in the public square. My name is Tanner Fox. I'm one of the pastors at First Pres Orlando and a colleague of Case's and his guest host for today. And I am glad to welcome back our friend Josh Chatraw, who was with us last week. Josh works at Beeson Divinity School. He's a professor there and leads all sorts of things in relation to kind of public Christianity and apologetics, which is the topic for these two episodes. So Josh, thanks so much for being with us yet again, and looking forward to our continued conversation today. Well, last week we got to talk a lot about kind of the landscape and, what are you seeing in the world around you, Josh? What am I seeing as a pastor in terms of these opportunities for evangelism or conversations around apologetics, a little bit of the posture of the culture around us. You mentioned a lot about, the ways that people are engaging the world as like a lot of moral issues right in front of us kind of all the time. And not always a charitable way to deal with those things when they're having conversations with folks. And that can change our perspective as Christians in terms of whether it sparks fear in us, maybe pushes us to kind of withdraw from the conversation entirely, or maybe it, gets our 6-shooters ready and we're kind of, coming in guns blazing, trying to, shake things up a little bit. And so what I really appreciate about Josh and his work, not only Apologetics at the Cross, which is probably the one I know best and my favorite, but all of the works that you've worked on, Josh, have a lot to do with kind of our posture and these sorts of things and the ways that we're seeking to engage the world out of a place of love and humility. It's hard to write a book about apologetics at the cross without having a posture of humility to say this is the recognizing our dependency on God and recognizing His work in us following that work in terms of death to self, crucifixion is the way forward. And so I've so loved that about your work. And today I would love to turn our conversation even more practical if we can. And so if we kind of talked about landscape and method in our last segment, I would love to, lean more into what it looks like for folks to kind of show up at work on a Monday morning and have some of these ideas bouncing around in their head. And so maybe one buzzword would be apologetics, but another might just be public Christianity or public witness in terms of how we're engaging our world. So why don't we start there? Why don't we start with that larger idea of apologetics or public witness kind of moving into the workplace? Josh, what's the first thing you think of when I say that phrase or those words? Like what pops into your brain?
Public witness or apologetics?
Let's do public witness. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Those are pretty different.
Yeah. No, I think, well, what I would say is that the greatest apologetic, the greatest public witness is the lives of the people of God. And the worst public witness is the lives of the people of God. And so it's a life that keeps in step with the gospel, that is the best witness to the gospel. And when our lives are not in line with the gospel, it undermines the gospel that we proclaim. And so I I believe strongly that that the kinds of people we are, and the type of coworkers and workers we are, and are we people who slander, and
Hmm.
are we people who gossip? Are we people who work hard, or do we live quiet lives, as Paul describes, where we seek the good of those around us, and to love even people we strongly disagree with, people who are
Hmm.
our enemies. I think all of these are ways we bear witness, and it's also important to bear witness with words. I'm not suggesting anything like just living lives that are in line with the gospel. Yes, we should do more than that, but
Hmm.
I that's where it starts.
Hmm.
And the reason I start there is because um, we often um, think about kind of technique or rhetoric, and it's a lot easier for us to kind of point our finger out there at the culture and say that's the problem.
Hmm.
Where it seems like the Christian instinct, going all the way back to Jesus, who's is to look at the plank in our own eyes
Hmm.
before we pull the speck out of our brothers, or before we denounce our enemies. It's to say, okay, is my life living in line with the gospel?
Hmm.
And so I think that's where we start.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean that there's not a speck out there in our brother's eyes. It definitely doesn't mean that we don't um, proclaim the goodness of God's word, and the problems when we deny God's word, and when we deny God in public as well.
Hmm.
Yes, it's not an either or, but a both and. But I do think it changes the kind of posture and demeanor of how we do this when we start with our own lives.
Hmm.
It's kind of like the kind of church, when if you've grown up in a church that's like, the problem is the culture out there, and everyone after the sermon comes and pats the pastor on the shoulder, because it's like, man,
You got him.
you really got him,
Yeah.
and it was like,
But you
yeah,
were
but
talking to us. We're in here.
yeah, those people maybe needed to hear that, but none of them were there, right?
It's
What do the
hilarious.
people need to hear in front of you? Because what you've just told them is all of our problems are out there.
Yeah.
And that doesn't that I mean, that doesn't seem like a biblical pattern, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
prophets would, yes, they would critique culture out there, but their focus was the people of God.
Yeah.
And so we often want to be prophetic about those people,
Hmm.
but not our own lives and not our own communities. And again, I think there's a time to say, hey, there's a fabric to the universe, and the reason you're experiencing what you're experiencing is because you're against the grain,
Yeah.
God's grain of the universe. Absolutely. But again, it's a matter of where we're going to start. And then when we do that, again, as I said in the last episode, it's not you're wrong, and let me tell you how you're wrong. It's more of in the posture of Lewis, in that great line from the Great Divorce, when he says, that's the joke, we're all wrong.
Yeah.
And once you can admit that, then you can begin living. And I don't know. I
Isn't
wish we had
there?
a little bit. I wish we had it. It doesn't play well, right? Because a lot of the political rhetoric now is don't admit any weaknesses.
Sure.
And there's no weaknesses in Christ. I'm not worried about that, but I've got plenty of weaknesses.
Yeah.
So I can own up to that, and I don't have to kind of live out of an inferiority complex.
Hmm.
I'm like, yeah, uh, I'm guilty as charged. But then
Hmm.
once you're able to say that, man, that's so freeing. Oh, yes,
Hmm.
I don't have all the answers.
Hmm.
That's not what public witness is about, having all the answers.
Hmm.
Okay, but I can bear witness to what I do know, because it's been revealed to me
I wonder
by
if that
Christ.
sentiment in particular wouldn't be really helpful to people. It's just like, hey, what we're talking about here is not having everything so buttoned up that there's nothing that's going to kind of stump you or give you pause or
Yeah,
tell you like, hey, I get it. I would have to learn more about that before I could comment on it. Like,
yeah, and I think that's one of the things. I mean, on one hand, I want to say there is a kind of anti-intellectualism
Mhm.
that has pervaded segments of the church, which just says like, I shouldn't have to think. Like,
Sure.
let's put everything on the bottom level, and I just want it to feel good and don't think about anything.
Mhm.
And there's a word, we need to pull that plank out of our eye. That's a problem, right? I'm
Mhm.
not suggesting that. And I think,
No.
some of the objections, some of the things that come up, they come up over and over again. It's, oftentimes it's thinking about 7 or 8 kind of different objections, and then you've thought about 95% of the ones you're going to hear.
Sure.
So, so some of this is we just, it's good to think. It's good to
Mhm.
read, right? Like, that's good. Those are good things, and we need to get back on that. But on the other hand, if our view of like, hey, I can't be a public Christian until I have this all figured out, you will never be a public Christian.
Yeah.
You will never be like, but some of this is our misunderstanding about what Christianity is. It's like
Hmm.
Christianity is kind of, or being an apologist or being a public Christian is me having all the answers. I've got this figured out.
Hmm.
And it seems to me that yes, Christianity gives us a vision of the world,
Mhm.
but part of that vision has always been kind of having mystery, has being
Mhm.
us not knowing many things,
Mhm.
and being okay with that
Yeah.
and living with that, um, and a way to live without a certainty on every issue. And so it actually, to me, the kind of Christian worldview uh, can can accept our contingency,
Mm.
and the things that we don't know, and make sense of that,
Mhm.
and that's just fine. Rather than kind of acting like, hey, Christianity is about you being able to answer all these questions,
Mhm.
and if you're not really a faithful public Christian.
Yeah.
I just think we need to get that off the table. That's not reality. And
Mhm.
when somebody comes up, and I think part of what's happened sometimes is we have this vision of the apologist who answers everything. But sometimes those apologists who are answering everything, once you look at some of their answers, they're actually rather glib.
Mm.
And people end up growing out of them,
Mhm.
of those answers, right? Because they've tried to put everything in a little box and make it really easy.
Yeah.
But then the young people, the real bright ones that I've taught, who've maybe grown up with a kind of thin, glib apologetic, they end up growing out of that kind of
Mhm.
stuff. And either they go deeper and reflect more, or they have some major kind of deconstruction
I
issues
was gonna say
that
if
they
it's
have to
thin, it
deal
might
with.
shatter, and
Yeah.
I've watched that happen before too, or just a life circumstance kind of contradicts the way that they maybe understood a caricature of the fabric of the world, and then all of a sudden it's like, wait, if that's wrong, is everything wrong? And you
Yeah.
kind of run down a road that's like, whoa, that if you were willing to
Yeah.
be patient and maybe approach apologetics. I even almost hear you saying like if people approach apologetics as if they're the teachers versus being the students, and it feels like that's a lot of what your work talks about. It's like you do need to know the culture you're in. Like you do need to
Yeah. Yeah.
sit
Yeah.
under it at least a little bit to say, I truly understand
Well,
what you're saying about the world
well,
before I can engage it.
and Christianity is a kind of, I mean, what's the heart of Christianity? It's communing with the living God.
Hmm.
It's walking with Him,
Faith, dependency. Yeah.
and so it's a way of life.
Mm.
And I think when we kind of, I think sometimes just unintentionally, right? Because on one hand, we've got 2,000 years of Christian reflection, and it's rich and it's deep, and we should be, some of us are just going to just like eat that up, right? Give me more books and give me
Yeah.
more, and amen to that. But when sometimes we can kind of, if you're built that way, it can just become like Christianity is a math equation.
Mm.
Christianity is a kind of data collection rather than theology is always meant to point us, and the kind of thinking is pointing us to the kind of relationship with God, the communion with God,
Mm.
a way to walk in His presence, and and so we can lose the communion part of
Hmm.
Christianity, which is the heart, right? That we would
Yeah.
know God and see Him and be
Hmm.
and so I think part of this is both living that out, but then also speaking about Christianity as more than just a clashing of worldviews, a clash of ideas, right? And and I've got all the answers, and I'm going to smash you with those answers. What
Hmm.
Rather, it's like, actually, I don't always have all the answers. I think Christianity has great answers for things. Don't get me wrong. It's kind of what I do,
Hmm.
but it's actually much more than that, right?
Mm.
Theology is always pointing to a deeper reality.
Mm.
Um, and it's a deeper reality, and Lewis talked about this, that we have to fall into constantly, both as apologists, but also in our invitations. We're
Mm.
inviting them into a reality to live forgiven and in the
Hmm.
presence of the living God. That is the invitation, not, hey, come follow me because I've got all the answers.
Yeah.
Because you'll run out of answers, okay?
Yeah.
And if you think you have all the answers, you just haven't been around long
I was
enough,
gonna
and
say
you
you
need to
haven't
read.
bumped into the wrong question
Yeah,
yet.
you need to read more books. You need to learn something, so you learn how much you don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, that's I it just shows a kind of level of naivety if you go in and saying, hey, I've 2 + 2 my way to God. Now why don't you follow
Mm.
my math and come along with me? That's just not how this works.
Yeah. It's a little different. So I kind of hear you saying, as we turn to maybe a couple case study
Yeah.
kind of ideas, I hear you saying paying attention to our own character and moving ourselves, paying good attention to the way that we're engaging the world with humility and with kindness, seeing the story of God kind of as it infiltrates ours and grace pours in, is just as important probably as the ways in which we are gathering arguments or thinking through the rational ways that we would defend.
Yeah.
There's a apologetic of life that is deeply important. And even, I mean, I'm sure as folks are listening to this, there's probably some conviction around like, are you a gossip? Are you lazy? Are you any of those things? Because those would, in some ways, portray the opposite of an apologetic of the
Well,
Christian life, as
yeah.
God has a fabric that says, here's how I want you to live and move and be in the world. And
Yeah.
at the very base level, you're not doing that. That's troubling. But also, something you said in the first episode was like being a great listener, and kind of making enough space in our busy, efficient lives to be curious, and to double listen, I think is the way you talked about it from John Stott, as we're listening to the world and listening to what God's doing too. So is that a fair, relatively
Yeah.
fair summation? Okay, great.
Yeah. And I would just say one more quick thing is to say,
Sure.
I think part of the pressure that we feel is that and this has come at us through a lot of different things, but we feel like apologetics or evangelism or public Christianity is about control.
Hmm.
In other words, I'm going to be in a conversation, and I need to control this
Yeah.
conversation.
You mentioned
In
the
fact,
Enlightenment being a part of
yeah,
why we
oh
think
yeah,
that way.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mentioned it in the last episode, but that's kind of spilled over into kind of how we view relationships
Yeah.
and how we view evangelism and apologetics. So
Mm.
I don't want to go this way. I don't, but there's a lot of kind of, I don't want to go too deep here, but there's a lot of kind of ways that speak about this as like staying in control of the conversation. Here's technique. We will give
Mm.
you the technique, and you kind of manage this.
Hmm.
And I'm wanting to say, well, actually, this is about being attentive.
Hmm.
It's about being attentive, and that you're a good reader and listener, and so I think reading good books helps us become special novels and stories help us be good listeners to the
Yeah.
world, be listeners to people, but being also a good listener to the Spirit, being attentive to what the Spirit's doing,
Mm.
and not being in control. Actually,
Hmm.
I want to say, I don't want to come in here and feel like I need to manipulate this conversation. It doesn't mean that I'm not kind of thinking about and trying to understand the cultural context and I will say some things to challenge people, absolutely.
Sure.
But I don't want to mechanize this, right?
Yeah.
And I think when you start doing that, people start feeling that way, right? This is part of the
Hmm.
scariness of it. It's like, okay, I'm gonna try to control you, and that's what this is about.
Yeah.
And so what sometimes happens is we see apologists on the debate stage, and then people who are budding apologists want to take that into conversations.
Mm.
But that kind of genre of the debate stage, right, is
Different.
not.
Yeah.
It's like it's like if you just got married and you're just like, well, I've learned how to talk to people by looking at debates, and that's how you're going to talk to your wife. You're in trouble. You're
You
right.
might think
It's
you won a
not.
lot, but you probably didn't.
Yeah, you will. That's a good.
Everyone
Yeah,
lost.
It's that line from that old movie White Man Can't Jump, and I just like quoting that on podcasts, but
Yeah.
it's like, when you think you win, you've really lost,
Yeah.
right? And I think what happens is we go into these, this one genre of kind of conversation. We think that's what being an apologist is. And then you either run from that because we don't want anything to do with that, or we try that. And then we wonder, like, why is this not going so well in everyday conversation? Well, because that's a particular genre of debate, which often, not always, but can turn into just a spectacle. And versus the kind of conversations that 99% of us are going to be in, and the kind of engagements that 99% of us are going to be at aren't that way. Unless our primary way of engaging is online, which is going nowhere fast if you're trying to deal with this in the kind of comments of of social media, right? It's going nowhere fast as far as actually persuading someone. So I think part of it is just giving up control, but I think that's actually good news. Like, it's not up to you. That's actually really freeing, right?
Yeah.
I'm free to be attentive to the Spirit. I'm free to, and I know we need to get to some specific issues in this episode, so I'll be quiet. But I would want to set that as the context. Hey, be free to just attend to this person, attend to the Spirit, and have a conversation with them. I think that takes a load of the pressure off.
Yeah.
You're not the Messiah. You don't do the saving. But you can attend to this person. You can ask good questions. And you can attend to what the Spirit is doing, and be bold. Absolutely, be bold, be courageous, speak gospel truth. But I do think that takes the pressure off.
Yeah. Just briefly, before we get into a little case study, I had a family coming in who was moving from a different faith tradition hopefully into our church, and they decided they wanted to read the Westminster to figure out what we believe. And I got a phone call that said, we need to have a meeting. I have some questions. And I was in my like, let's argue this out mode, which is not like, I'm a pastor. I don't know why I ever enter that mode. I shouldn't. I just should care for people. But we get in there and they're asking good questions, and ended up the real question they wanted to ask was around assurance of salvation. And we were talking it through rationally, logically, all this sort of stuff. And then from some other training I've had in some therapeutic spaces, it was just like, leave enough. If there's empty space, just leave it, see what comes of it. And so we're sitting there, and I feel like I've said what I've said, and they've said what they've said, and it's just quiet. And then finally, I kind of noticed that the wife there's tears running down her face, and it broke the conversation into the space that it should have been in the whole time, which had everything to do with a child of theirs who was in the faith as a child, and then had gone wandering for a long time. And it was just a mother who was deeply fearful for her son. And this was not a question of, do we believe alongside you guys, and can we, be covenant partners in your church? These were like experiential questions and aches and longings from this woman that were such a gift for us to then be able to talk about. And it did end up in a space that had a lot to do with, like, I wish I had better answers for you, but I also want you to know that I will join you in prayer for this son of yours, as long as it takes, kind of deal.
Yeah.
And it became a humanized, we're not, measuring notes here. We're talking about the aches and longings of the heart. And it was just it was a humiliation for me in a little bit, because I had gone in with such a different spirit. But Jesus was kind enough to offer me the space to get to be with them in a way that felt a good bit different and really good and beautiful in a lot of ways. So anyways, let's move from there to, let me give you a little scenario.
Okay.
So let's just say you're a software engineer, and your team is discussing a project that is all technology. Everything about it's technology. But in the midst of the conversation, you have some moral concerns as to whether or not we're utilizing that technology to help people or kind of exploit, it's not so far on the moral side of anything like completely grave, but just enough. It's a gray area where you think, hey, the secular world's totally cool with this, but as a Christian, I don't know about that. So how would you kind of bring this public faith into a conversation like that in a secular space?
Oh yeah, that's good and tricky. I didn't get this. I didn't get this question beforehand. So.
You did not. I'm sorry.
Yeah. But it's also general enough there's some vagueness there, and that's okay in how you asked it. But I think, I mean, one thing is just to say some honesty. I think that's my initial reaction. You're welcome to chime in and save me here, Tanner. But I think my initial reaction is just some honesty of like, hey, I'm working through this. I'm
Mm,
working through this. Given and some of this, just to be honest, might be my kind of own personal way I see the world. But I'm very concerned that in developing this technology, we would not be exploiting anyone in
mhm.
any way. And so that I know this might be profitable for the company, this might be profitable for us, but at the end of the day, for me, if I know this is going to be exploiting people in this certain way, that might that like I would want to back out of this project or have more conversations about should the company do this, or at the very least, is there another way that I can be perhaps even assigned to another project, but I'm still working through that. And
Mhm.
I'm assuming that some companies might and some coworkers might engage you in that, and some might just look at you like you have
Yeah.
three eyes or something.
Yeah.
But I think I would at least want to speak to that, right, and say this is where I'm at, or at least this is what I'm working through.
Mm,
I know that, again, that's my initial reaction. I know that there might be some companies that you don't have that freedom to kind of say that, or you
sure.
don't feel that freedom to say that. Um, and I think that can be said with a kind of humility,
Mhm.
which isn't like, hey, all of you scoundrels don't care about this, but I do. I think there's a way to kind of get at that where you're saying I'm working through this one. In what you described, it's a gray area. So it's like, hey, I'm working through this.
Yeah.
And there's still a kind of the theologian Oliver Donovan talks about the crater marks of the gospel, and how the gospel in the Western society has kind of left these craters. Well, people who aren't religious still, or who aren't Christian, still feel certain Christian values.
Mhm.
Things like, well, we shouldn't exploit people,
Mhm.
or there should be consent, right? That there should be consent in relationships, and other values that Christianity brought into the world. And I think that sometimes these things can be shared when you express those people, and you're willing to express those. People will say, yeah, that's a good point. I haven't thought about that. And so
Mhm.
sometimes you can have even co-belligerence, is the language sometimes used, with people who don't agree with your beliefs in God and beliefs in Christ, but they have these ethical values that they actually
Mhm.
share with you. And then all of a sudden you have something in common, which could, over beers or coffee later, I'm Baptist, so it'd probably be coffee, but these things can be talked about, right?
Yeah.
And you can pick up on that. Now you have something in common. And
Yeah.
um and when they see the kind of courage that you're willing to, in a humble way, just kind of say, hang on, what are we doing here, guys?
Mhm. Yeah, I love
What do you
that.
think, Tanner?
I think it answers kind of both sides of that question, because I think, if you're thinking about public witness, then it has something to do with having convictions around the things that you do or don't do in the workplace. And so, to draw the conversation back to a values conversation, are we first and foremost for our client, and do we want what's best for them? And so if we're doing something that might lead them down, let's say with the technology, like a more addictive way of using our technology,
Yeah.
is that really for the good of our client? Clearly, it's good for the bottom line, but is it good for the way that we view humanity and the part we want to play in people's
Yeah.
lives? And maybe you do get overridden, right? Maybe you're not. Maybe you're the lowest on the totem pole on that. But I can imagine a world where that opens a conversation with other coworkers over a coffee or something, that gives you the space to say, I actually do have some strong convictions about how people are made and what they were made for, or even I'd just love to hear what y'all think people are made for,
Yeah.
and I love the way that could become a conversation long term, as you get to kind of bear witness to your beliefs and convictions, but also to maybe push against, or who knows. I mean, as you said, the fabric of the world is built by the Lord, and so I think the more we lean into it, whether it's professionally, institutionally, or individually and
Yeah.
organically, is going to be better for us in the long term. And I think you even see that across some spheres right now, in terms of the ways that some tech companies are kind of being looked at as like, wow, you guys are, what we thought was just a really great way to connect is actually a way to make people, deeply addicted and more lonely. Like, man, is that so good that you did that the way that you did that, and built algorithms to keep people locked into your stuff for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours? Like, are you contributing to the problem or the solution as a social, connecting, networking space? So I think that's really helpful. Why don't we do one more and then we'll call it a day?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So let's say you are in some form of leadership in a local nonprofit, and part of the work is to connect with other nonprofits in the city, and you end up with a group of folks that have very varying beliefs and worldviews, but potentially or possibly maybe like deeply progressive, and you guys just see the world very differently. What kind of how would you engage that space, or maybe even what kind of counsel would you give someone who is walking into those spaces where collaboration is necessary for the good of the city, but there are just competing ways of seeing the world?
Yeah. I think a couple of things. One, I would say transparency is really important.
Mm.
To be able to say, hey, look, let's not be under any false pretense here. Just like it, we want to work with you guys because we think we agree on this. Like, like I don't know what it is. Like we actually want to care for the poor in our community. It seems like you guys want to do that too, and we want to do that. And so we think there's an opportunity that we might be able to help each other with this task, right? But at the same time, we don't want to be under any false pretense and you guys imagining that somehow we embrace all of what you embrace. And I think it's important for our people to know that too, right? And so if you're in an organization that's, if I'm understanding the question correctly, a church or a Christian organization, to be able to say, hey, we're partnering with this group. We've been very clear to them kind of what our views are. And we're also want to be very clear with you where we disagree with them at.
Yeah.
And yet there's an opportunity for us because we do overlap in this particular aim. And it's also an opportunity for us to rub shoulders with people who don't agree with us, who don't see the world like us. It seems like, Jesus did that kind of thing. And so I think it's really, really important on the front end, if you're on a Christian organization, to be really clear about what you're doing, because of our world now where just everybody's kind of always looking and is really like, hey, what's going on? How could we be engaging, even in non-official ways with this other group where everyone has to pick a side? It seems like when you do that, you end up with these pockets, right? And we never speak to each other and we dehumanize each other. But part of the issue is because we're part of this polarization in the church, a lot of people will misunderstand what you're doing and you're not doing. So it seems to me that you would need to do some teaching on the front end, and also be really just be really deliberate about having these conversations with all parties. So that's some of my initial thoughts. Am I getting at the question, or you want to add?
I think
to this,
so,
Tanner?
because I think as Christians we can sometimes have the challenge of thinking we have a hard time figuring out where to draw the line in terms of partnership and not partnership if worldviews aren't aligning, And so I think that's a challenging thing. I was the pastor of mission here before I took over discipleship, and we did a lot of stuff in the for the homeless community, and so those partnerships were varied, in a lot of different ways. And trying to figure out, can we partner with the city? They're asking us to do certain things. Local government's asking us to not do certain things in order for us to be considered a partner. At what point does faithful witness go to the wayside, and how do we understand where that line is? Or if I'm thinking about friends who are own local businesses and they want to be a part of kind of smaller groups of small businesses that want to serve the community, but also stick up for one another. But, maybe there's a strongly varying understanding of worldviews in those spaces and just how do they engage those things. So yeah, I think it's kind of about, common grace for the common good. Like, how do we be here? And what would be, at what point are we giving away too much? Maybe is another way to ask it as Christians.
And those are often wisdom, right? And I think those are wisdom things rather than it's always just so black and white clear. And I think there's and hey, look, I mean, as I mentioned before, Jesus wasn't overly concerned about, didn't seem overly concerned about, what those religious elite were going to think about him because he was hanging out with the tax collectors and prostitutes. But, I mean, let's just face it. I mean, we're in a cancel culture. We're in a culture where there's a lot of guilt by association.
Yeah.
And so the ability, if we're paralyzed by that, the ability to actually go and engage the local city government or engage this group and actually maybe work together while at the same time bearing witness to them as you're doing becomes hampered because your biggest fear is being called a name by, the Christians on the other side of town or somebody on social media. And I think we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware of the confusion that once you get called that name is going to ensue within your organization or within your church.
Sure.
And so if you haven't preemptively kind of done the work of like, what are we doing? Why are we doing? Let's work this out as a group of leaders. Let's communicate it. Let's dialogue as a community. And then you run into it. It's going to be like chaos on the back end, right? But if you say, hey, here's our priorities. Here's some lines that we've drawn. Let's all think about this together. And then when it pops up, because, somebody's not going to love the fact that we're working with a city government because, for whatever reason, then we've actually had this conversation on the front end. And so but it also, all that takes courage too, right? I mean, I think it takes courage. It's a lot easier just to stay in our silos. It's a lot easier just to say, we're only going to work with, we're only going to really engage and we're only going to kind of cooperate with people who believe exactly the same things as us on every single thing.
Yeah.
But then you actually, people are left to just their own kind of, their own imaginations or what they see on social media.
Sure.
To kind of, about Christians. So if I do think we need some front porch spaces. We need some places in our community where we can gather and we can cooperate, we can engage, and all of that. We need to humanize one another. And that's so important, that kind of work of just, can we, and I think some of it can be official and sometimes it's just wiser that it's more organic. And I get that. And so, okay, well, maybe we don't want to, because this gets really complicated, maybe we don't want to go into any kind of official mode, but how can we organically be there? How can we be there when, and help serve just as a group from our church who shows up to help on cleanup day, knowing that this other group's in charge of it and we don't officially, rile things up, but can we show up as a group and engage in as individuals, but there as a kind of community, unofficially there to serve the poor in our community in that example. So I think there's ways we can be creative on this, and not everything has to be officially, done.
It was in our little example, we ended up really just bumping into our own limits. Like, we don't know what we don't know about how to do this. And so it was actually more out of our need to partner than theirs, which put us in this position of humility. Honestly, that was just like, if y'all don't help us out, we're going to keep spending the same amount of money with a lot less effectiveness. But if we can partner with you, like, this will be a real gift to us. And I really think for our folks, it was more just engage in the conversation and for them to know it was well thought through, that it wasn't just something flippant, like, oh, we just jumped at an idea, but instead it was like, we really think, like, for the common good of this city, this would be a really wise move. I think you mentioned that as like the way. So I think the principle there that helped me is the idea that, in terms of our continued walk with the Lord, it will be one where we're constantly looking up saying like, is this right, Lord? Like, is this where you want me to go? Is this a partnership I should engage or not? And sometimes it'll feel black and white, and a lot of times it maybe won't. And you'll just be, leaning into the faith side of what that looks like in terms of faithfulness. So that's awesome. Well, how about this? The very end here, what might be one thing a business leader or layperson in our church or that's listening to this podcast could do in this next week or so to start to engage the world of sharing their faith?
Yeah, I would say invite somebody out for coffee or into your home for a cup of coffee that you haven't attended to. And without any kind of pressure that says, okay, I've got to give a full gospel conversation, but just go into that asking questions, having thought through. There's a great little book by David Brooks on, I think it's like How to Know a Person. And it's a wonderful, it's got different elements that are helpful, but I think some of the best parts are just the practical parts of learning to listen and learning to how to really know a person. And so if you did that over the next 2 weeks, if you just said, hey, there's a coworker, there's somebody who started at work or somebody I don't really know that well, I'm just going to invite them for a cup of coffee. I'm going to take the initiative, and I'm going to, nothing that maybe would make me feel super weird or awkward, maybe a neutral space rather than your own home. But I think that can, and not putting too much pressure on yourself to say, hey, I got to argue them into, but also being open to doing that as well. Like that you could bear witness, being attentive to the Spirit and being open to being bold, but at least beginning with a kind of holy curiosity, and maybe just to add to that, look for somebody who's maybe quiet or is lonely or is actually kind of have your antenna up for people who aren't maybe just that person you're dying to spend time with, but somebody who needs some kind of care and attention. Have those people on your radar screen. Often what I find on this is that in our kind of world of optimization and efficiency, it's really striking when someone takes the time to try to know somebody, to ask them their story. Even if you don't in that conversation get to the gospel, I think there's like there's a kind of way you're bearing witness in that you care for that person and you're humanizing them, and you're telling them in so many words, I see you. And establishing that kind of communion with another human, I think it becomes a lot easier to point them to their need for communion with God.
Yeah, it would be very hard to help cure a soul apart from knowing it and what its maladies are. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Josh, thank you so much for your time, both in our first episode and in the second. Just as a reminder, folks, Josh has a lot of great books out there: The Augustine Way, Apologetics at the Cross, and it will have a bit of a facelift coming sometime next year. So that's exciting. Telling a Better Story again is one of my favorites, and then again our current. Unfortunately, this is the one I've read the most from you right now. I'd love to go back to the other ones, but even the children's book is such a joy around our house. So make sure you pick some of those resources up. I know Josh said that the first thing to do is invite people to coffee, but I will say quite honestly, Apologetics at the Cross has been an unbelievably accessible resource when it comes to thinking through a reasonable way to engage people's stories and then draw them near to the foot of the cross and the crucified Christ and the risen Christ. And so cannot recommend that enough. And I didn't say this earlier, but it also has such a great history of apologetics as well. So it gives you not only the landscape, but also like how to move forward, which I think is so good. So great. Well, Friends, thanks so much for being with us here at Nuance. We are wanting to continue this conversation that folks can be formed for faithfulness, that people can engage the public square in ways that feel like they are walking in step with the Spirit and living lives that are beautiful in the likeness of Jesus in all the places where they live, work, and play. So thank you for joining. Make sure you like and subscribe and share around as you can. We'd love more folks in these conversations as we try to, as I said, just live faithfully. So glad to have you with us. Josh, again, thanks so much, and pray blessings over you as you continue this work of sabbatical and writing and all that fun stuff. And let me close with a short benediction, and we'll be done. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you. May he be gracious to you in every way and give you peace. In the name of the Father, the Son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Take care.